I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Bishop Guli Francis-Dehqani. I heard Bishop Guli speaking at the Winchester Festival of Faith and Literature, which we run last year, and something she said stuck in my mind, which was that the church from which she came, the Anglican church in Iran, very small, very persecuted, with almost no resources, had a gift that she felt could offer the wider church. And a bit of a sort of theme began to emerge yesterday. Paula preached about words, and at the late night liturgy, Doug Gay was speaking about sustaining the weary with a word, which is really all we have at our disposal as preachers. It's such a small thing, 26 letters, out of which to conjure everything we have to say. And Bishop Guli's talk will develop that theme, encouraging the weary with a word, the small things we have, the fragile things we have. When we feel we're depleted, those are the things with which we can encourage those to whom we minister. So please welcome Bishop Guli to our Festival of Preaching. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much indeed, and good morning. It's a tough gig to follow Sam Wells, but we'll see how it goes. It's really very good to be here with you. Thank you to Christine and to Jutta and to others who've planned the event. It's particularly lovely to be back in this building, actually. When we first arrived in England back in 1980, we were offered accommodation in Ridley Hall for a year, and this is the church where my parents settled and we worshipped, so it is very special to be back. I started my role as Bishop of Chelmsford just over 3 years ago, around the time when the world was emerging from the COVID pandemic. And one of the things that I noticed as I met with and listened to people was the high levels of weariness, a deep and invasive exhaustion with subtle overtones of disillusionment. In many ways, it wasn't surprising given what we'd gone through as a global community. But my sense is that the weariness has lingered. 3 years on, it's still evident, and not just in Chelmsford. There's a whole host of reasons for this. In the first instance, there's never been a clear end to COVID. I remember in Leicester, where I was before moving to Chelmsford, we talked several times about having a service to mark the end of the pandemic, to recognise the horror and the pain, and then intentionally move on. But it never proved possible to hold such a service because the end of COVID, particularly in terms of how we experienced it at its height, was messy. There was no clear line between the during and the after, and now, of course, we're learning to live with it. So we've done very little by way of processing. We haven't been able to draw a line under it or take time deliberately to ponder its impact and understand what it did to us. During the worst of it, there was a sense that the pandemic was providing us with an opportunity to rethink how we live our lives more generally. A chance to retune, if you like, with a slower pace and a different set of priorities. Arguably, however, as a society, we didn't quite take the opportunity as fully as we might have done. Most of us have simply slipped back into the old ways of doing things, living life at a pace that feels unsustainable and yet without the ability to put the brakes on. There are other factors too which feed into this lingering weariness. The growing disenchantment with politicians and public figures, the effect of the wars in Ukraine and Gaza and elsewhere, the rise in the cost of living, growing anxiety about the environment, the increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots, and the impact of social media, toxic at its worst, creating silos and echo chambers that put more and more strain on the forming of relationships across difference. All of these, undoubtedly, also bring out the best in people. And there are extraordinary examples of the goodness of human nature and of simple acts of kindness and decency that we shouldn't forget, and which are, of course, a source of hope for the future. Nonetheless, it feels like something corrosive has crept into our culture, and that unless we attend to it, it will further infect and damage communities. And the signs of danger are evidenced by weariness, but also by cynicism, suspicion, mistrust, contempt, impatience, aggression, and so on. I started talking about the weariness in Chelmsford Diocese, and then I quickly broadened that out to consider wider society and the culture around us. I want now to return my focus for the remainder of this talk to the church at large, but to retain as a backdrop awareness of the bigger picture. And that's for two reasons. One is that our responsibility is to engage with wider society, not to shut ourselves off from it. And the other is to notice the extent to which we in the church seem to be mirroring the behaviours of those outside the church. Instead of Christians modelling a different way of being, all too often we reinforce exactly the same emotions and patterns of behaving. Why is that? I realise we're all human beings. The church is a flawed institution, and so it's not surprising that what you experience outside the church, you also experience inside it. But still, I do have to ask, shouldn't our faith make a difference? Shouldn't the good news of the gospel influence how we respond to our circumstances, even when things are tough and difficult? Isn't that the whole point? After all, we follow a Saviour whose faithfulness took him to the cross. We were never promised an easy ride, but called to a life of sacrificial discipleship, all the while loving God and loving neighbour. It's a tough call, granted, but it is the call. So why are we finding it so difficult? Why are there still such high levels of weariness, as well as cynicism, suspicion, lack of trust, and all the rest? Well, again, there are many reasons, and we don't have time to address them today. But I want, if I may, just to lift up the corner of one possibility for us to explore a little more. I wonder if in the church our weariness and all the other emotions and behaviours are fueled by a deep sense of fear and anxiety about our future, and in particular about the future survival of the Church of England. We are shrinking in numbers and influence, and we feel it is our responsibility to do something, anything, to avoid this existential threat. Panic and fear, coupled with a sense of responsibility to fix things, exacerbated by grief about what we feel we've lost, is altogether an exhausting cocktail. No wonder there's so much weariness. And weariness, if unchecked, can lead to lethargy and a refusal to face up to our situation in a positive way. We point the finger of blame elsewhere and look to find fault with others in order to ease our own conscience. If only that particular group with whose theology I disagree would go away. If only the vicar did more visiting. If only the diocese. If only the bishop or bishops. We are, as a church, I want to suggest, so caught up in a whirlpool of fear and anxiety that we're in danger of being sucked down a plug hole of our own making. We are disorientated, fixated by the past that we've lost and the future we dread, such that we're becoming unable to engage in a meaningful way with the present. We're trying so hard to scramble out of the situation that we don't seem able to stop and consider whether God might actually be saying something to us in these very circumstances. It seems to me that the approach the Church of England has broadly taken is to develop stringent methods aimed at moving us beyond this crisis point, to create programs and strategies to ensure that we increase in number and grow in size. There is an awful lot of talk about thousands more young people and tens of thousands additional worshipping communities. There's now a national vision and strategy department with a large staff team. In order for any diocese to access funding, they have to demonstrate fidelity to the central vision, which is predicated on growth and predictions of growth. Money will not be released to help us appoint additional parochial clergy, but only for projects and resources over and above the basic framework that any diocese is managing to fund through parish share and endowments. When I was still relatively new in Chelmsford, I explored some of this during an address to Diocesan Synod. And this is what I said. As a rule, I'm not so comfortable with the language of vision and strategy being deployed in the Church. It risks, it seems to me, putting too much emphasis on our human powers. That if only we try hard enough and pull together well enough and all follow the same program, then we can solve the problems and challenges and ensure the future survival of the Church, either much as it has been in the past, or preferably producing a shinier, bigger, better version. The language of vision and strategy risks ignoring the reality of frailty, brokenness, sin, all of which can, of course, be redeemed. But it risks missing the blessings in that which is small and vulnerable and marginal. It leaves us relying heavily on our own strength instead of remembering that everything depends on our faithfulness and our reliance upon God. These reflections seem to chime with a number of people, and to my great surprise, gained a little bit of traction on Twitter as it was then. I should also say that they earned me a slap on the wrist from Central Church. Who told me that such talk undermines the work of the Vision and Strategy Department. That was definitely not my intention. I'm not a troublemaker. I was simply speaking with my own diocesan synod, reflecting on what I was discerning locally. But I was shocked that one lonely voice could be regarded as so threatening within the wheels of power, especially in a church that claims to want more diversity. The whole experience was quite a learning lesson for me, if nothing else, about the strength of the pull of the centre. But back to our present reality. There's no denying that our numbers are declining and influence is diminishing. I'm not suggesting that we ignore that or pretend it isn't happening and bury our heads in the sand. I'm suggesting rather that we face up to it, but not imagine that we can control our way out of it by setting targets, devising plans for getting us there, and spending millions on projects that fit the mould. Instead, let us dwell a while and listen to the whisper of the Holy Spirit, to hear if there might just be a still small voice beckoning, "Come to me, all you that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." a voice that may help us find meaning in the present, a voice that confirms our primary calling not to be successful in worldly terms, but to be intentional in our faithfulness and prayerful in the present moment. Consider for a moment the story of Peter walking on the water towards Jesus in Matthew 14. The disciples were in the boat in a state of great fear and agitation. Jesus calls Peter, who gets out of the boat and starts walking on the water towards him. Peter then takes his eyes off Jesus and begins to concentrate on what's all around him: the strong wind, the danger, the utter stupidity of what he's done. His attention moves from Jesus to himself, the mess that he's in, and how he's going to get himself out of it. And that's when he starts to sink. Now, the impression we have in reading the story is that Jesus is some way ahead of Peter. But what actually happens is at the moment Peter acknowledges his need of Jesus, which is his moment of greatest desperation, he cries out for help. "Lord, save me." And Jesus is immediately right there beside him, lifting him out of the water and back into the boat. Jesus, who had seemed far off, was in fact always very nearby. Peter simply had to acknowledge his need, recognize his own frailty, and call for help. Perhaps that's exactly what we need to do more of. Some, I know, are close to feelings of despair and desperation. So this is the moment to cry out, "Lord, save me." Not to strive to find the answers through our human powers, but acknowledge our frailty and rely on God's strength to lead us to a better place. Certainly, we can learn from the secular world of businesses and organizations, but in the end, we are not a business or an organization. We are the body of Christ, God's beloved people, those who strive to stay faithful with our eyes fixed firmly on Jesus in season and out of season, when we see the fruits of God's blessings and when we don't. The church historically has waxed and waned in size and influence. It continues to exist by God's grace, and I want to suggest that it has seldom been at its best when it's been largest and most powerful. Now, please don't misunderstand me. It doesn't give me any pleasure to see shrinking congregations and a church that seems to be retreating. Along with others, I rejoice when people come to faith, where congregations increase in size. We are indeed called to baptize and make disciples. Mine is not an invitation to laziness or passivity, to feeling sorry for ourselves or giving up. Mine is a plea that we, individuals and congregations, remember and return to our basic vocation, which is to love God through prayer and worship and love neighbor through devoted service. To live this vocation faithfully and joyfully without fear and anxiety about the future, working hard, doing our best, being intentional in mission and ministry, and always remaining faithful and hopeful. A small congregation can do this just as well as a large one. And who knows how our efforts and faithfulness will bear fruit in the future. We plant the seeds in smaller or larger ways, and God brings forth the harvest according to God's will and timing, not ours. Some years after my parents have died, I still encounter people who met them, often very fleetingly and many years ago, but whose lives were touched by that encounter and who still want to tell me about it. I share this by way of encouragement. Ours is not to know the results of our efforts. There is no conversation or encounter, no sermon or meeting, no email or phone call that doesn't have the potential to be used by God, however small or inconsequential it may seem to us. Broadly speaking, there are two reasons why the current drive to increase in size and numbers worries me. One is practical and the other theological, although inevitably they overlap. The practical one relates to my concern for the well-being of clergy and, by extension, congregations. The constant mantra that we must grow, indeed that we are going to grow if we follow the strategy, the deliberate setting of targets to increase the number of worshippers, the judging of a church's success according to its size, all this is putting undue pressure on clergy who are overstretched and congregations whose morale is low. Increasingly, I see clergy who are feeling like failures because they aren't meeting the expectations that our church culture is heaping upon them. This doesn't mean that we don't have difficult decisions to make. We do, and we must face up to these. But the feeling of failure causes anxiety, even fear, and then leads to weariness and the other emotions and behaviours we've already spoken of. In truth, our clergy and our lay leaders are our greatest resource. Our congregations a gift and a blessing from God. All these are to be loved, treasured, encouraged, and yes, sometimes challenged to be who God has called them to be, to discern what resources they do have and how they might use these in the service of the community, to be faithful in the present and joyful, not burdened by how things used to be in the past or paralyzed by fear of obliteration in the future. We cannot and must not continue placing unreasonable and unrealistic expectations of growth in numbers on the shoulders of our clergy. If growth is to happen, it will be God's doing. Theologically, this whole drive for growth troubles me too. And the reasons are bound up with my own life story and experiences. And my apologies to those of you who are already familiar with this, but I need to explain as briefly as I can for the benefit of those who don't. I was born into the tiny Anglican church in Iran where my early faith was fostered. In 1979 came the Islamic Revolution, which swept through the country and turned our lives upside down. Our schools and hospitals were confiscated or closed down, our financial assets were frozen, and our legal identity removed. Church offices were ransacked, properties damaged or appropriated. Foreign missionaries were all recalled home, others fled or were forced to leave, some were imprisoned, injured in attacks, or assassinated. It seemed that the church was being stripped of all that had been built up by faithful Christians over several generations. Things that had been good and blessed by God were indeed taken away. But in the process, we were being invited to learn the meaning of discipleship in new and deeper ways, to learn what it means to walk in the way of the cross. Nearly 45 years on, numbers now are so small as to be virtually insignificant. The infrastructure is practically non-existent, leadership is scant, baptisms are illegal, and the persecuted community live under daily pressure and uncertainty about the future as the government continues to squeeze the life out of them. Arguably, the Anglican Church in Iran was a human experiment that has failed. And yet, against all the odds, the faithful remnant remain. They are small in number, utterly marginal and without influence in wider society, and their survival seems to hang by a thread. But they are there. They are present and they are faithful. And while they remain, they witness to God's love and faithfulness and to the miracle of life in Jesus Christ. And in so doing, they offer hope for all of us. Yes, they are small and insignificant in worldly terms. They have no institutions and in some cases no church buildings either. But in God's sight, they are like the priceless, precious pearl, loved and valued. And more than that, over the past 40 years or so, without missionary support or institutions, with very few resources, without leadership to provide long-term vision or strategies for growth, the Holy Spirit has been active in Iran and amongst Iranians. Despite human weakness and failure, and during a period that should have seen the church eradicated, there has been an extraordinary surge in the number of those who are exploring faith and coming to Christ, often through the underground church movement and often at great cost to individuals and their families. Surely this is a lesson for us, a gift offered by the persecuted church, that when given space to breathe, the Holy Spirit works through our fragility, brokenness, and failures. Our task isn't to control our way into the future, but to lean more heavily on God, prayerfully discerning the next step of the journey, seeking always to be faithful and loving, whatever our present circumstances. So all of this has given me a theology that is cross-shaped and yet full of hope, a theology which allows for transformation through suffering, that values the small and the marginal and relies on trust in the one who leads us into the future one step at a time. The resurrection too is seen through the lens of the cross. It is not triumphalist, nor does it speak of worldly power and influence. Rather, it offers a glimpse of God's kingdom and God's true nature, as shown in the example of Jesus Christ, whose moment of greatest suffering was also his moment of greatest glory. This turns upside down our notions of success, and it offers us a pathway from fear and anxiety towards hope. The church in this country is undoubtedly changing, and we don't quite know what the future looks like. We are perhaps the seed that is dying before shoots of new life come forth. Change is always painful, and yet we know that if God is for us, no one and nothing is against us. And therein lies our hope, and perhaps a word for the weary too. Like Mark's Gospel, I had two endings. And I think with your permission, I'm going to go for the slightly longer one. It's just an additional 3 or 4 minutes. So let me finish, if I may, by sharing with you what I remember from a talk I attended in the spring of 2023 in Tallinn, in Estonia, at the 5-yearly General Assembly of the Conference of European Churches. The speaker was the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa. He presented us with a picture of the ideologies that have shaped Western democracies and demonstrated how they are predicated on the notion of progress and growth, aggressive competition, dominance and power, both internally within Europe, the capitalism that our society is based on, but also when set against other world powers. To succeed, businesses and organizations must not only keep pace, but prove themselves ahead of the game, able to continue growing and progressing, innovating and modernizing, destroying others as necessary. But in the process, individuals, human beings, are being crushed by the unbearable and unreasonable pressures. It is destroying our planet and impacting our mental health, leading to depression and burnout. The whole model is unsustainable, and yet it keeps marching onwards. Professor Rosa suggested that instead, societies need to develop a model based on what he called resonance. the space to engage with others whose ideas are different, to learn and adapt, to reflect and appreciate, to connect more deeply and allow for the possibility of transformation. He suggested that Christianity already has those spaces, or at least at our core, we strive to provide them. And that is why society still so desperately needs the church. Spaces to pause, slow down, listen to one another and to God. Crucially, however, we should provide such resonance spaces without trying to predict what will emerge. He said, if the church believes that it always knows what is right and what should come out of it, then it is no longer a resonance institution, but a resonance killer. That, in a nutshell, describes something of my discomfort with the vision and strategy approach. It has already defined the outcome as being one of growth and increase. But what if God is saying something different to us about learning to be a new kind of community? What if we have things to learn during a season in which we're smaller, more marginal and less influential? In our drive towards an agenda of growth, might we be missing something essential in our Christian identity and calling? Can our local churches become places of resonance where the weary find rest and refreshment? And that is where I'll leave you. Not so much with a definite answer, but with some questions and an invitation to continue pondering. But also with some encouragement to remember that the future of the church is in the hands of God, who will lead us one step at a time. In the words of St. David, in his last ever recorded sermon, all that is required of us is to be joyful, keep the faith, and do the little things well. Thank you.
Bishop Guli, thank you so much. I could tell from the hums and the ums that your words resonated very deeply. I wonder how weary you were when you arrived yesterday. Wonder if you're feeling a little less weary, hearing those encouraging words. You wanted to leave us with space for questions, and we do have some time for questions. We have the roving mic, so if you would like to ask Bishop Guli something, have one hand already, I think. The mic will be brought to you.
I'm going to have to go back up, aren't I? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guli. Very refreshing. I suppose I really want to know, I mean, I've just retired from ministry after 36 years, and some of this vision and strategy stuff really drove me out of it, to be honest. What you didn't say is how it sometimes emboldens bullies, lay bullies within parishes, to be on your back all the time. And why aren't we pushing further and greater than... I just like to know, I mean, I don't want you to get into further trouble, but I mean, I feel our bishop in Portsmouth is kind of, in some ways, sort of sympathetic to what you're saying. But are there others who think like you? And if so, can there be some change in direction from? I mean, where I am, a vast sum of money has come into one particular church, while other churches, for this great project that they got, and while others are starved of cash. And I mean, and we all know that. I mean, are there others who think like you? Can you say that? Could there be?
Well, thank you for your concern about me getting into trouble. I think that ship has sailed, probably. But, I think I go back to the lesson I learnt when I spoke to Dowson Synod. The pull of the centre is very, very strong. and it's a hard tide to swim against. I think there is. I think there is a lot of kind of feeling about, questions about whether the money as it is distributed in the best way. The reality is that many dioceses are struggling to maintain the basic framework, and so doing stuff over and above that is just crushing. So I think there is, and my sense is that perhaps it's beginning to be vocalized a little bit more. But yeah, the wheels of power are quite strong, and one or two voices isn't going to make a lot of difference. It's going to need a whole kind of reassessment, and I'm not, please don't misunderstand me. I don't think that the projects and so on are bad. That lots that's going on is good, but in the process, the basic framework is being crushed, and so that's a challenge. How can we do both? I do think there are growing numbers of voices, but they're still quiet and very much from the margins, which is fine. The margins are a good place.
Thank you so much. I'm from the Netherlands, in which the same developments can be seen. My question is, in terms of education, what will be needed for the clergy or people who work in the church? What kind of education is needed to understand that you can't always do the things that people want you to do or people expect you to do?
Do you mean as clergy, in terms of expectations of congregations? Yeah. I take the point about people who experience bullying and the whole laying on of expectations. But, it's also from within. The sense of expectations come from different places. It does come from outside, whether it's, the church or whether it's the congregation. But I also see a lot of clergy who heap it upon themselves, and we don't need to be at everything. We don't need to be driving everything. Our role is actually to bring forward others and to help educate a congregation to see this is your church. I'm coming in and then I'm moving on. This is your church. You need to play a part in it. Sometimes I think clergy play the same game, if you like. It is tough. But I think that archdeacons and other people in diocesan structures should be able to come alongside to support if there are particular problems. But I think it's also about how we train clergy to do a job which is now very, very different to what it was even 20, 30 years ago, arguably. I think it's always been a challenge in the Church of England. Our training often trails behind the reality of what the job has become, which is kind of understandable, isn't it? But I think we could be looking at our training models, but it's also about educating congregations. And I think, certainly something we've talked about in Chelmsford is how do we, where there have been significant problems and the previous incumbent or previous two or three feel that they've been hounded out, maybe there's a role for people from the diocese, mission and ministry, archdeacons and so on, to actually get alongside the congregation and say, we're going to do some work before we appoint another priest. So there is an educating job to go on, both in terms of how we prepare clergy and the expectations we heap on ourselves, and how we prepare and help congregations. Not straightforward, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Bishop Guli, for what you said, and in your description of the weariness of the church and what we might feel as individuals. I think also part of it has been through COVID, a loss of identity, national identity, and perhaps smaller identities. And I would like you to say a few things about something that I have seen as a tension in the church. If you could talk about what you see as possibly the most wonderful emerging identity of the Church of England in the context of what you say about possibly shrinking numbers and less influence. And that is the tension between an uncomfortable unity, and early on in your talk you talked about if only people with whom we disagreed could go away. And yet what we now perceive emerging from COVID, emerging from this extraordinary time of some reflection, and what we perceive as the truth we need to be speaking in our culture, in our world. And I think part of our weariness and anxiety, and may I say depression, is that we are constrained to speak our full truth for fear of getting our wrists slapped, or fracturing this unity that we all want to keep, because one of the beauties of Anglicanism is that it is a broad church. And I see a lot of tensions there and difficulties with where the church is now. And I just wonder if you could comment on some of that.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, I wish I had some easy answers. You know, what feels sometimes like it's happening is truth is being pitted against unity. And you're either for unity or you're for truth. I'm not sure, well, I'm sure many of you would agree, I don't think any of us possess the truth. At best, we're seekers after truth and seekers after unity. And that's what we're kind of striving towards. It's always been a tension for the Church of England, hasn't it? How to keep together a broad church. And there is a real desire to maintain that. I still maintain that the church is at its best at the local level. You know, it's the big church, the national church, the diocese, whatever, they get the headlines, and they're often negative. But actually, at its local level, churches, often regardless of what their theology is around LLF, because I think let's just name it, they're often doing really good things locally. And most people either don't know what their view is or frankly don't really mind. You know, people who are struggling in their lives with enormous challenges. So I'm still hopeful that it's local. The church, if it's engaging with the community, and that's what it's about, looking to this community, recognizing what the needs are, and discerning what resources the church has in order to serve. That is still going on very widely. How we find our bigger unity, you know, we're living through it. I don't know, I don't have the answers. I do have this sense that we just have to hold steady. There's an awful lot of panic around, and I understand the urgency, you know, both of those who want to stop it all and those who want to progress, you know, much faster. But you know, our time is like a blink of an eye in God's eyes. And so just to hold steady and to allow events to unfold, again, without unduly trying to control them. I think we are my hunches, and I'm really not involved in the politics of this. I've not been involved in any of the groups. My hunch is we are inching towards a model that will allow most people to stay. I hope that in contrast, gosh, I really am getting myself into trouble here. Is all of this still being recorded, isn't it? I hope that in contrast to the arrangements that were made over women, that we will put a time scale on a review. I think not doing that means that things just get entrenched and continue without the opportunity to pause and reflect again from a further distance. So whatever arrangements are made, you know, it's not going to be straightforward, it's going to be painful, and I would encourage us to hold steady, continue being the loving communities that you are in a way that meets the needs of your community, and trust that we will emerge out of this. We will emerge out of it. But we're the ones that are caught in the middle of it, and it's painful.
thank you so much for your words, Bishop Julie. They resonated. I'm actually from the church in Wales, and we've been doing some work recently around giving clergy some extra time off. Shock. And I'm very aware that there is a lot of exhaustion around. I know a number of clergy who are saying I'm exhausted, I've gone on to antidepressants to cope, which means actually our ministry isn't sustainable, and it's gradually killing people, really. So I suppose I'm just wondering, in practical terms, what do you think could be done to make it a more sustainable ministry?
Yeah. There will never be enough hours in the day or the week or the year to do all the ministry that there is to do, to complete all the tasks, each of which is worthy and important and wonderful. I was talking to somebody last night, and I can't remember now who it was. It might have been Sarah, actually, at dinner. There's a book called, I think it's called 16,000 Weeks. Any of you come across it? I can't remember the name. 4,000, sorry. 4,000. I knew it was some. Is that all? Is that 4,000? Well, thank you for that, because that's quite even more shocking. The title of the book is basically the average lifespan. So we have an average of 4,000. I thought it was 16. There you go. You see, I've and the point of the book is to say that in life, as well as in careers, as well as in our day-to-day task, to-do list, we will never complete everything. So we start from a place of saying, I acknowledge that by certain choices I make, other things won't happen. In every area of life. One example that the author uses is, for those who get married, you are immediately committing yourself to that person and saying there are potentially others that now are not going to be an option. So in every area of life, and I wonder whether there's something about that in ministry, that we want to do it all, we want to fix the problems. We're not there as problem solvers. We're not social workers, we're not nurses and doctors, we are accompaniers. And people in the end will remember us for how they experienced us, rather than for the specific things we did or the tasks we completed. It's really hard, that, because we live in a culture that judges success on the basis of progress and growth and productivity. Ministry doesn't offer those things. We have nothing to show at the end of the day in terms of something that's productive, other than the nature of our relationships. So maybe it's about completely rethinking or re-articulating what the purpose of ministry is, in order to release us. The two foundational, and I often remind clergy of this, because I read every MDR report, and I hear what you're saying. I see it, and I meet with clergy, and I say, your fundamental vocation is to pray for your people. Pray for your people and retain a sense of your own spiritual life. Everything else flows out of that. You're loved and valued because of who you are, not because of what you produce or the successes that you achieve in your ministry. But those are deep things. Each person has got to get there for themselves. Me saying it or you saying it isn't going to make a difference. We have to do the work ourselves. This goes back a little bit to what Sam was saying in his sermon. You are chosen, you are loved, regardless of whether you think you failed in terms of worldly success and so on. And these are vocational things. They're true for all of us as human beings and as Christians. And they're not going to be solved by any one person offering a different perspective. It's work that we have to each do internally and support one another as a community, or whether it's a parish or a diocese or a national church or whatever it is. Support one another as communities to help those who are struggling. We all need people to carry us at certain times. It's a rambling answer, I'm sorry, but it touches on so many different threads.
side? Oh, right. Oh, yes. Okay, I'll go this way round here. Where's the hand? Let me pass that along.
Morning, Bishop. My name's Al. I'm from Lincoln Diocese, and we have lots of things going on with process. But I want to ask you a preaching question, if I may. You finished your sermon talking about loving our neighbour and loving our God. And I think sometimes, this is the reason I'm here, is that sometimes that inspiration isn't always there and you don't always see it. My wife said to me the other day, whereas all that kindness and goodness from the COVID times gone, because it appears to have disappeared. Perhaps you could give us some words of encouragement with regard to preaching on the love of God and of our neighbour. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hope that what I shared with you was an encouragement to do that, to draw, learning and deepening of relationship through things that are small and marginal and may not appear hugely successful and so on. But you're absolutely right. I think, you may be surprised. I experience an awful lot of bad behaviour. Clergy, but also lay people. If you looked at my inbox, you might be quite surprised. My response to it, and look, like everybody else, there are times when I, in great anger and frustration, imagine in my head what I'm going to say to the person, or indeed draft the email. I never send it until I've slept on it. And I always come back to the same point. However cross or frustrated I've got, and how, far from perfect as I am, and I'm not always kind, and I'm not always generous in my thinking, but I always come back to the same thing. I can't control what anybody else does. I can only try and model what I believe is the right way myself. That's really hard. Because we lash out, it's human nature, we lash out, we're unkind, we're ungenerous in our thinking. But that's what we're called to, not to make you do that, or anybody else do it, but to just model it ourselves. And if we could all do that, we'd have a different culture and environment. But preaching should be encouraging. It should also be challenging, of course. And there are times to challenge and there are times to encourage. And there are many good examples in all of our communities that can be drawn out, if you like, to remind people. But yeah, modelling behaviour ourselves. I haven't found a better answer than that.
My daughter is ordained and has 2 small children of 4 and 2, and she works full-time in London and has 1 day off a week. Who do I lobby to try and get clergy 2 days off a week, please?
Well, General Synod have made some headway, haven't they? The last meeting of General Synod, isn't it now a day and a half? A number of things in relation to that. In Chelmsford Diocese, I encourage clergy, as I do myself, once a month, every 4 to 6 weeks, to have 2 days off together. So that's just something we've said, and I encourage people, and I model it, and so, but again, people have to take responsibility. I still have clergy saying to me, but I don't have time to do that. Well, you have to prioritise. I'm not going to stand over you with a stick and beat you into having 2 days off, but the offer is there and it's genuine. The other side is that, and this comes back to the expectations we heap on ourselves, yes, the work is endless, you could work 24/7, but also we have quite a lot of agency. We can put limits around our work, we can build gaps into the diary. It's just that we're not very good at it. I remember being encouraged years ago by somebody saying, put some gaps in your diary, mark them in your diary, and if anybody's looking over your shoulder, you can just say, I'm sorry, that space is already taken. There's something in it. Now, it may be that you have to be flexible and a funeral comes in. I'm not talking about hard boundaries. You may need to be flexible, and some weeks will be heavier than others. But actually, again, we can use our agency to set some boundaries. And, you know, yes, we only, in theory, have one day off a week, but we also have quite a lot of control over our diaries. So when I was ordained before my children were born, the flexibility to be able to be at the school gate, to go to the school play, to not have a long commute to work, you know, all of those things are also positives. We tend to dwell on the negatives. But expectations, using our own agency, setting boundaries, I think are more important than saying we officially need to say 2 days rather than a day and a half. The 2 days might help, but ministry is never going to be containable in hard set boundaries, in my experience. And it does mean that some weeks are busier, but it also means you don't have to be guilty when you have a quieter week. And I think that's what clergy, many of us, and I speak as one myself, struggle with, that when I'm not doing anything, I'm feeling guilty that perhaps I should be doing something.
Bishop Guli, thank you again for those wonderful words of wisdom and encouragement. We could go on all day, and perhaps you would like us to, because you're now going off to the House of Bishops. If they let her in. Well, we could capture you and keep you with us. But please give a round of applause to Bishop Guli.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much. All the best to you. God bless you.